Hi guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. So we've now considered one cause of political instability in the Weimar years of 1919 to 1923, the challenge posed by the extreme left. So now, of course, we must explore the challenges posed by the right and to what extent they actually threatened Weimar democracy. So first, let's just explore a few key terms. That is coup d'etat or putsch. Now, these terms, the first French and the second German, are used to refer to a secretly plotted and sudden attempt to overthrow a government, usually by force, and usually using the military. A coup is normally organized by a small group of people, such as generals or a political party, who try to take control initially by seizing the key centers of power. In contrast to a revolution, a coup doesn't need mass support to succeed necessarily. And normally a coup or putsch comes from the political right, attracting support from the elite, and a revolution usually comes from the left, therefore attracting support from the lower classes. And so with those in mind, let's have a look at our first theme here. Well, opposition from the extreme right differed from the left, both in its form and in its extent. On the right wing, there was a mixed collection of opponents to the Republic, and their resistance found expression in actually quite different ways. In theory, in contrast to Marxist socialism, the extreme right didn't actually have an alternative organized ideology, apart from perhaps a shared intense nationalism. And it was simply drawn together by a growing belief in the following. First of all, anti-democracy. It was united by its rejection of the Weimar system and its principles. It aimed to destroy the democratic constitution because it was considered weak and a major contributing factor to Germany's problems. It was also anti-Marxist. Even more despised than democracy was the fear of communism. It was seen as a real threat to the traditional values and the ownership of property and wealth. And when Russian communism was established, it reinforced the idea that communism was anti-German. Thirdly, also authoritarianism. The extreme right favored the restoration of some authoritarian dictatorial regime, although in the early 1920s, there wasn't actually any real consensus on what kind of strong government and leadership would actually be established. And finally, we have also nationalism. This was at the core of the extreme right because Germany's national pride had been deeply hurt by the events of 1918 to 1919. And not surprisingly, from the time of the Treaty of Versailles, this conservative nationalist response reinforced the ideas of the stab in the back myth and the November criminals, those who had signed the November armistice and supported the Democratic Republic. The war, it was argued, had been lost due to unpatriotic elements within German society, as we've already mentioned, including people like pacifists, socialists, Jews, and also Democrats. And right-wing politicians found a whole range of scapegoats to take the blame for German acceptance of the armistice. The second element I want to discuss about the extreme right is the different organizations within that. The extreme right appeared in various forms, and it included a number of political parties and was also the driving force behind the activities of various paramilitary organizations. Now, the first key group we must consider is the German National People's Party, the DNVP. Now, this was a coalition of nationalist-minded, old imperial conservative parties and included groups such as the Fatherland Party and the Pan-German League. And from the very start, it contained extremist and racist elements. And although it was still a party of landowners and industrialists, it had a broad appeal among some of the middle classes as well. And it was by far the largest party in the Reichstag on the extreme right and was able to poll 15.1% in the 1920 election, which is a considerable amount. Now, the second element I want to discuss is racist nationalism. Now, the emergence of this, or in German called Völkisch nationalism, was clearly apparent before 1914, but the effects of the war and its aftermath increased its attraction for many on the right. And by the early 1920s, there were probably around 70 relatively small splinter nationalist parties, which were also racist and anti-Semitic. One example being the Nazi Party. Bavaria became a particular haven for such groups, since the regional state government was sufficiently reactionary to tolerate them. Reactionary meaning opposing change and supporting a return to traditional ways. One such group was the German Workers' Party, founded by Anton Drexler. Adolf Hitler joined in 1919 and became its leader in a very quick time, in about 2 years. However, during the years 1919 to 24, regional and policy differences divided such groups, and attempts to unify the nationalist right actually ended in failure. It wasn't until the mid-1920s that Hitler began to bring the different groups together under the leadership of the NSDAP, the Nazis. A third group is the Freikorps. Now, the Freikorps that flourished in the power war environment, in the post-war environment, attracted the more brutal elements of German militarism. And as a result of the demobilization of the armed forces, there were nearly 200 paramilitary units, paramilitary meaning informal, non-legal military squads, in Germany by 1919. And they were employed by the government to suppress the threats from the extreme left, but they did also become a law unto themselves, and this became incredibly dangerous. Since they were anti-Republican and committed to the restoration of authoritarian rule, they had no respect for the Weimar governments and were quite prepared to use acts of violence and murder to intimidate others. Their bloody actions, as I've already mentioned, became known as the White Terror. Now, another issue that happened was to do with the growing number of political assassinations. And from 1920, the Weimar government tried to control the actions of the Freikorps, but a new threat emerged from the right wing in the form of these assassinations. The brutalizing effects of war, the revolutionary origins of the Republic, the political struggles of the period, and the challenge to traditional values encouraged some right-wing Germans to resort to murder to weaken the democratic regime. These Vaterländische Verband, or also known as patriotic leagues, often formed out of the old Freikorps units, acted as fiercely anti-republican paramilitaries. The lenient attitude to such actions of conservative judges who had been kept in their posts in the New Republic reinforced this trend. And the Republic lost hundreds of devoted servants through assassination, including one of its greatest statesmen, Walter Rathenau. So if we look at the years 1919 to 1922, there were 376 political murders, 22 by the left and 354 by the right. The most notorious terrorist gang was known as the Consul Organization because it was responsible for the assassination of a number of key Republican politicians. Matthias Erzberger, finance minister from 1919 to 1921, was murdered in August 1921 in the Black Forest. Now, he had already been shot in January and left wounded, but the assassins were determined to complete the job. He was a Catholic, a member of the ZP, and had signed the armistice and the Treaty of Versailles. And even after his funeral, his widow continued to receive death threats. On the 24th of June, 1922, Walter Rathenau, foreign minister, was driving to work in an open-top car when 4 assassins shot at him and held a hand grenade for good measure. His crimes were to be Jewish and committed to democracy as a leading minister in the Republican government. There was actually widespread discontent as he was a really popular figure. And the following day, over 700,000 protesters lined the streets of Berlin, and the value of the mark fell as other countries feared the repercussions. And then Karl Gerres, leader of the USPD, was murdered in June 1921 because he was a committed socialist. Now, these are just a few examples of the key politicians murdered by the Consul Organization. In July 1922, the Reichstag passed a law for the protection of the Republic, imposing severe penalties on those involved in conspiracy to murder, and banned also extremist organizations. However, the law was ineffective because the judges who had to enforce it, as we've already mentioned, were right-wing sympathizers. Although there was a strong reaction against these murders, all the revolts and assassinations served to foster disillusionment with the new regime. And most Germans had the opportunity to express their opinions in elections in 1920 after the Spartacus Rising and the Kapp Putsch. However, their reaction, 1 year into the regime just demonstrates their changing ideas, as voters for pro-Weimar parties such as the SPD significantly reduced, and those votes for anti-Republican such as the DNVP actually increased in the 1920 elections. So let's take a look at some specific examples of uprisings from the extreme right. Well, hostility from the right against Weimar democracy came to a head with two major uprisings, the Kapp Putsch and the Munich Beer Hall Putsch, but we'll deal with the latter in a separate lesson. So if we look at the Kapp Putsch then, the Freikorps played a central role in the first attempt by the extreme right wing to seize power from the constitutional government. And this was because by early 1920, there was considerable unease within the ranks of the Freikorps at the demands to reduce the size of the German army according to the terms of the Versailles Treaty. And in February 1920, the defense minister ordered two Freikorps brigades, about 12,000 men, to disband. And that was the Erhard Marine Brigade and the Balticum that was stationed in the Berlin area. And one of the leaders, General Clausewitz, actually refused. And along with other disgruntled army officers and a man named Wolfgang Kapp, who you can see behind me, a Prussian civil servant and leader of the right-wing German Fatherland Party, who campaigned for the restoration of the monarchy, Clausewitz planned to overthrow the government. He contacted other generals, including Seeckt and Ludendorff, but they were non-committal. And on the 12th of March, Clausewitz and Kapp encouraged 12,000 troops to march on Berlin and seize the main buildings of the capital virtually unopposed, where they installed a new government headed by Kapp. Significantly, the German army did not provide any resistance to this putsch. And in spite of requests from Ebert and the Chancellor to put down the rebellious forces, the army wasn't prepared to become involved with either side. Although it didn't join those involved in the putsch, it actually failed to support the legitimate government. General Hans von Seeckt, the senior officer in the Defense Ministry, spoke to many colleagues in his reputed declaration on the outbreak of the putsch on the 13th of March 1920, saying, "Troops do not fire on troops. So you perhaps intend, Minister, that a battle be fought before the Brandenburg tour between troops that have fought side by side against a common enemy. When Reichswehr fires on Reichswehr, then all comradeship within the officer corps will have vanished." So you can see there, he definitely was adverse to allowing his army to kill other members of the army. Now, the army's decision to put its own interests before its obligation to defend the government forced the latter to flee the capital and move to Stuttgart. And you can see behind me, it's quite a lot further south than Berlin in Germany. However, the putsch still actually collapsed. Before leaving Berlin, the SPD and communist members of the government had called for a general strike, which paralyzed the capital and quickly spread to the rest of the country. Moreover, the most conservatives, civil servants and bankers refused to recognize Kapp's government, and most actually remained neutral. After 4 days, Kapp and his government exerted no real authority, and they fled the city, and Ebert's government returned to Berlin. At first sight, the collapse of the Putsch could be viewed as a major success for the Weimar Republic, because in the 6 days of the crisis, it had retained the backing of the people in Berlin and had effectively withstood a major threat from the extreme right. However, what is significant is that the Kapp Putsch was typical of its right-wing attitudes and its lack of sympathy for the Republic. And during the months after the coup, the government failed to confront this problem. For example, the army leadership had revealed its unreliability, yet amazingly, at the end of that very month, instead of taking action against army leaders for their lack of support, Secht was actually made chief of the army command, in which he remained from 1920 to 26. And he was appointed because he enjoyed the confidence of his fellow officers, even though his support for the Republic was lukewarm and the government realized it might still need them against the communists. So for them, the threat of the communists is outweighing their concerns about the lack of support from the right. Now, under Secht's influence, the organization of the army was remodeled and its status redefined. He imposed very strict military discipline and recruited new troops, increasingly at the expense of the Freikorps. Secht was determined to uphold the independence of the army. He believed it had a privileged position that placed it beyond direct government control. For example, he turned a blind eye to the Versailles disarmament clauses in order to increase the size of the army with more modern weapons. Now, many within its ranks believed that the army served some higher purpose to the nation as a whole. It had the right to intervene as it saw fit without regard to its obligations to the Republic. All this suggests that the aftermath of the Kapp Putsch, the Ebert-Groener Agreement, and the Constitution's failure to reform its structures had left the army as a state within a state. And this is the situation where the authority and government of the state are actually threatened by a rival power base seen in the army. Now, other lessons learned from the Putsch were that the army was not to be trusted, the government needed the support of the army, civil servants could be disloyal, and the workers were a powerful force that needed to be reconciled. The judiciary also continued with the old political values that hadn't had changes made since imperial times. It enjoyed the advantage of maintaining its independence from the Weimar Constitution, but it questioned the legal rights of the new republic and reached some dubious and obviously biased decisions, because those involved in the Putsch of 1920 never felt the full rigor of the law. Kapp actually died awaiting trial, and Luttwitz was granted early retirement. Only one of the 705 prosecuted were actually found guilty and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Although right-wing activity failed to destroy the Republic, the developments of 1919 to 1923 bolstered arrogance of anti-Republican nationalists who showed they could quite literally get away with murder. And since the Weimar politicians seemed constantly to exaggerate the threats from the left and to underestimate that from the right, the anti-Republican right wing was able to establish itself very firmly in the new German state.